He becomes our sacrifice. He's our scapegoat. And the third thing we see is the humiliation of Jesus in verses 6 through 8. It says he became a worm or a tola. Specific word is used. This is words because it notes the crushing of the tola. There'll be a couple pictures if we can get them up. I don't know if it's working today or not. But it's about the crushing of the tola, a red-blooded worm. It was to be applied to the garments as a red dye. That's the tola worm right there. He's crushed on our behalf, that his blood may be applied to us, that we might be made righteous. Notice he's also a reproach, it says, and he's ridiculed among the people. He was shamed and humiliated on our behalf. I like what Henry Morris, he describes the tola worm in this manner. Think of that worm right there. You can show the next picture too, Carl, of the tree. But let me read this to you. When the female of the scarlet worm species was ready to give birth to her young, she would attach her body to the trunk of a tree, like this worm does here, fixing herself so firmly and permanently that she would never leave again. And the eggs deposited beneath her body were thus protected until the larva was hatched and able to enter their own life cycle. As the mother died, the crimson fluid stained her body and the surrounding wood. From the dead bodies of such female scarlet worms, the commercial scarlet dyes of antiquity were extracted. What a great picture this gives us of Christ, dying on that tree for us, shedding of his precious blood, that he might bring many sons unto his glory. Hebrews chapter 2, verse 10. He died for us, church. Don't ever forget that. That he died that we might live through him. Psalm 22, verse 6, it describes that worm, and it gives us the picture of Jesus Christ. I'm going to share a little illustration to you that I found. I want to share this with you. But it was about an African prince who was visiting the African settlement at St. Louis Exposition many years ago. It says this: he was clad in citizen's clothes, and the people from Africa appeared in their native clothes. And when this stranger proclaimed himself to be a prince, they ridiculed him, they mocked him. However, an aged man said, "I can tell whether or not you're a prince of royal blood." And when he ran his fingers down the back of the neck of the one who claimed to be the prince, and he found the scar that was there, and that was the mark of his royalty. When he saw that, he fell upon his knees with all the others to worship him. And think about that. Jesus Christ stands before us as the lamb that's been slain. There's the scars in his hands, the scar in his side, his back, his brow. He's our Redeemer. And we shall know him because he alone suffered what all of us deserved, but he took it for us. He took it all. And so we move from the prophecy of the cross to the agony of the cross. Look at verse 9 with me. Then we talk about the agony. It says about the agony of what was going on during the cross. He says, "Yet you brought me safely from my mother's womb and led me to trust you at my mother's breast. I was thrust into your arms at my birth. You have been my God from the moment I was born. Do not stay so far from me, nor trouble is near, and no one else can help me. My enemies surround me like a herd of bulls. Fierce bulls of Bashan have hemmed me in. Like lions, they open their jaws against me, roaring and tearing into their prey. My life is poured out like water, and all my bones are out of joint." This is the agony of the cross. He says, "My heart is like wax melting within me. My strength is dried up like sun-baked clay. My tongue sticks to the roof of my mouth. You've laid me in the dust and left me for dead. My enemies surround me like a pack of dogs. An evil gang closes in on me. They've pierced my hands and my feet. I can count all of my bones. My enemies stare at me and they gloat. They divide my garments among themselves. They throw dice for my clothing. O Lord, do not stay far away. You are my strength. Come quickly to my aid. Save me from the sword. Spare my precious life from these dogs." He says, "Snatch me from the lion's jaws." Verse 14, "I'm poured out like a water and my bones are out of joint." I do not believe there was ever an event like the crucifixion of Jesus Christ. We witness this in three events. We witness the indignity of mankind. In verses 9 to 13, Jesus has placed his life in the hands of God. He's just, my life's in your hands, Lord. And from the innocence of childhood into this full manhood, Jesus' experience then ravages the hate-mongering crowd that's around him. Now he's naked, he's beaten, he's bloodied, he's humiliated, and he's crucified. Jesus was exposed to the pagans and the unbelievers of the world that day. And he compares them to bulls and lions. In this we witness, secondly, the inhumanity of mankind. In verses 14 through 18, that we feel the pain of what Jesus is going through for our souls. He's going through this for you and I. And this description was written, church, 1,000 years before the cross was invented. Think about that. This was written 1,000 years before the cross was invented, and yet the Romans perfected it as a tool for torture, pain, and death. I want to read to you a description of the crucifixion, but it cannot describe the excruciating pain that Jesus experienced on the cross that day. There was a medical doctor. This is going to be a little gross and gruesome, but I want to read it to you just so we can have an understanding of what happened on that cross. This is what this medical doctor provided as a physical description. The cross is placed on the ground, and the exhausted man is quickly thrown backwards with his shoulders against the wood. Just picture this as I'm reading it. The legionnaires feel there for the depression in the front of the wrist, and he drives a heavy square wrought iron nail through the wrist and deep into the wood. Quickly he moves to the other side and repeats the action, being careful not to pull the arms too tightly, but to allow some flex and movement. The cross is then lifted into place. The left foot is then pressed backwards against the right foot, and with both feet extended, toes down, a nail is driven through the arch of each, leaving the knees flexed. The victim is now crucified. As he slowly sags down with more weight on the nails of the wrists, excruciating, fiery pain shoots along the fingers and up the arms to explode in the brain. The nails in the wrists are putting pressure on the median nerves, and as he pushes himself upward to avoid this stretching torment, he places the full weight on the nail through his feet. Again, he feels the searing agony of the nail tearing through the nerves between the bones of his feet. And as the arms fatigue, cramps sweep through the muscles, knotting them in deep, relentless, throbbing pain. With these cramps comes the inability to push himself upward to breathe. Air can be drawn into the lungs, but not exhaled. He fights to raise himself in order to get even one small breath, and finally carbon dioxide builds up in the lungs and in the bloodstream, and the cramps partially subside. Spasmodically, he is able to push himself upward to exhale, and bring in life-giving oxygen. Hours of this limitless pain, cycles of twisting, joint-rendering cramps, intermittent partial asphyxiation, searing pain as tissue is torn from his lacerated back as he moves up and down against the rough timber. Then another agony begins, a deep crushing pain deep in the chest as the pericardium slowly fills the serum and begins to compress the heart. It's now almost over. The loss of tissue fluids has reached a critical level. The compressed heart is struggling to pump heavy, thick, sluggish blood into the tissues. The tortured lungs are making a frantic effort to gasp in small gulps of air. He can feel the chill of death creeping through his body. Finally, he can allow his body to die. And all of this, and the Bible records, he just went through all of that pain, all of that. And it's all the Bible says is, and they crucified him. What a wondrous love this is, church, when you think about what he went through for you and I. As the Son of God is hanging between heaven and earth, then they witness the iniquity of mankind's cruelty towards God's Son after all this happens. And these words are describing the injustice that man is inflicting on him. And yet he appeals to the Father as he suffers in verses 19 to 21. And he cries for help, deliverance, and rescue as these animals destroy him. They're destroying him. You know, I remember years ago, this is not even comparison. I remember years ago, my little girl, Kelly, she was on her bike one day. I'll never forget this as long as I live. But she was on her bike. She went for a bike ride. And she was driving down the street, and something happened, and she hit something, and she flew over the handlebars, and the neck of the handlebars took her chin here and just ripped it all the way down. And I remember she came home, her friend came home and said, Kelly's hurt, Kelly's hurt. We ran down the street to get her. We put her in the car. We took her to the hospital. And I couldn't go in the emergency. I had her in this room, and all I could hear was her gut-wrenching screams behind that curtain. Another time, my wife and I, we were driving, and my wife and I just got baptized, and we were coming back from the lake, and we were just so excited about being baptized, and this car shot across and hit us head on. My wife and both of us went through the windshield. She went through the front windshield, and I remember being in the hospital that day with her. She was on this side of the curtain. They were operating on me or fixing me up, but I could hear her as they're picking glass out of her face. That screaming and that screaming. The pain my daughter suffered and my wife was mild compared to what Jesus went through, church. And I was weeping that day. I was crying for my little girl and my wife. But what he went through, church, was way more than that. Our sin was paid for by the perfect Lamb of God. Don't ever forget that. And as we explored the prophecy and agony of the cross, let us consider the final aspect of the church.